So there are specific elements of the Renaissance that changed significantly. There's changes in philosophy, society, and politics. Probably the biggest term that you need to know out of this is humanism. Okay, so humanism is the study of classical manuscripts from Greece and from Rome. There's an emphasis on man's dignity and potential. It stresses man's rational abilities. Okay, so instead of sticking us in a box like during feudalism and working that box until you get to heaven, humanism is actually a little more focused on human potential and reaching your abilities. Individualism became an important part of society as well, where the medieval man feared pride. In the Renaissance, the individual had dignity, all right? So it was this group mentality to an individual mentality, and the idea that we can pull our own selves up by our bootstraps and be successful. There was also concern for secular life. There was an idea that man could discover all truth. It's not anti-religious, but it's definitely starting to think more on a secular line. And remember, secular is the separation between church and society, or church and state. Humanism and individualism, it began in the 1300s in Tuscany, once again in that state by Florence. And this is where you had the Tuscan Triumvirate, which is a group of three intellectuals that wrote extensively during the Renaissance period. And this is Dante Alighieri, Petrarch, and Boccaccio. Now Dante, he was a late medieval writer, and he wrote what was known as the Divine Comedy. And he wrote this in vernacular, in the Italian language, as opposed to most writing that was done in Latin at the time. He eventually got exiled from Florence based on his writing and ideas. Petrarch is considered the father of Italian humanism. He really took a lot of old Roman and Greek writings, manuscripts, and converted them or translated them into Italian. Boccaccio, on the other hand, he improved the Italian prose. He wrote something called the Decameron, which we're actually going to look at in class, the next class we have, which was a collection of tales. Neoplatonism, is an idea that you should know about, and it's this idea that came about during the Renaissance from some of these thinkers, such as Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola, from where in heaven we are in this perfect ideal state, and we're actually shoved into our dirty, filthy human bodies on earth. Okay, and we have to struggle with this using our mind and body to return to heaven after we pass on. So that's the idea of Neoplatonism. Okay. The importance of primary sources came about by the study of Lorenzo Valla. He was the father of modern analytical historical scholarship. He proved that the donation of Constantine was a forgery. So it's the idea of looking at documents and actually analyzing them and critiquing them in order to get the most information out of them as you possibly can. And we'll be doing a lot of this throughout our school year. And society changed significantly as well. They're socially limited and urban. All right, they lived in these nation states that were pretty secluded from each other, and really only the elite participate in a lot of these advances. It's very different from women than from men. Men can participate, while women are just supposed to inspire art and things like that. And this didn't really take place in the countryside. It's only really in those urban city centers that a lot of this stuff is flourishing. There's also a versatility in knowledge. In the medieval world, there was people that had specializations. All right, so you were a blacksmith, or you were a writer, or you were a poet, or whatever you were. In the Renaissance, on the other hand, it was the idea that you had this broad curriculum, that there was a Renaissance man. A Renaissance man is someone that's well-versed in a lot of different things. And we're going to look at the book of the Courtier, and look at what it meant to be a Renaissance man. You were supposed to be a warrior, you were supposed to be a gentleman, you were supposed to be an artist and a poet and a writer and a singer and all these different things together. During politics, questions started to come about, like who should rule and how should they rule. And one man that really wrote on leadership styles and things like that was Niccolo Machiavelli, and he wrote something called The Prince, which really analyzed politics and He made many observations and recommendations. For the most part, the prince or Machiavelli really supported absolutism and the idea that there's one person that should make the rules for everybody else. We'll be looking into this more in class. So eventually the Renaissance does decline. It lost its vigor in the 16th century, and it's at this point that it's starting to shift from the northern Italy to the north of Europe, and actually to the low countries of the Netherlands, France, and England. And it follows this trade in money. And it's at this time that Italy kind of starts to slide backwards a little bit because of the invasion of the French king. So that transitions us into the Northern Renaissance. So the beginnings of the Northern Renaissance were scholars and merchants in the 15th century carried the ideas from Italy back up north, okay? So there's a lot of trade going on at this time. Remember, the medieval times is over. Trade is starting to flourish. There's more money out there. And it's centered on courts and universities. And there's lots of universities up north in Europe. And also in the Northern Renaissance, they humanized Christianity, which was a lot different than what they did in Italy. In Italy, a lot of the art and focus was still on religious ideas. In the Northern Renaissance, people really focused more on realism and normal life. So Sir Thomas More is from England. He wrote a book called Utopia, and this is where he set out with a book that describes the ideal world and how we should be living. Erasmus is also an important thinker. He was in the Netherlands, and he wrote a book called In the Praise of Folly, which we'll be looking at more in our reading. Literature changed significantly. This is during the Elizabethan period as well. England, William Shakespeare, who you should know. France, Michel de Montaigne. And then in Spain, Miguel de Cervantes, which I believe you guys have probably read before as well. Probably the biggest, most important technological advance during this period is the printing press. Now, the printing press was not discovered or created or invented in Europe, but actually in China well before this time period. However, Johann Gutenberg, a German, took that technology from China and adopted it and made it much more efficient. So the idea of this printing press, it spread quickly. It made it much cheaper, much quicker, and much more accurate to print and reproduce books. And this really encouraged literacy and knowledge all around Europe. With the more accessibility to written materials, people really had a desire to learn how to read and write, and this encouraged literacy all over Europe. So the significance of the Renaissance is that it's a transition from the Middle Ages to the early modern period. That's why we start here in AP European history. There's a change in how man looked at himself, and like we said before, this is the idea of humanism, that we're a part of this group, we're part of this feudal pyramid, to the idea that we're actually an individual and we can make our own choices and decisions in life.